the identities of thousands of police officers and staff, but insisted he wouldn't resign. Ukraine says a temporary humanitarian corridor will open for commercial ships in the Black Sea, despite the threat of mines and the Russian Navy. NHS leaders say strikes by junior doctors are partly to blame for the waiting list for hospital treatment in England, topping 7.5 million people for the first time. And 5 American citizens have reportedly been freed from jail in Tehran as part of a deal that will unfreeze billions of dollars of Iranian assets. President Biden has declared a major disaster in Hawaii, where wildfires on the island of Maui have killed at least 36 people. Hawaii's Governor Josh Green has warned that the number of victims is expected to rise very significantly. Mr. Biden's declaration allows the release of emergency federal support. Thousands of tourists and residents have had to flee the areas engulfed by fire, with one describing the situation as like an apocalypse. Local people said they were still recovering dead bodies from the sea and so far hadn't received adequate help from the authorities. Our correspondent in Washington, Lorna Gordon, is monitoring developments.
If anybody's still out here, it's time to go!
The sound of urgent calls to those in Maui's main tourist destination of Lahaina as fast-moving flames approached the harbour.
The safe way is the beach. Just stick to the water.
Large parts of the city were burnt to the ground. The west side of the island was left almost completely cut off. Mason Jarvie was one of those who received burns fleeing the fires.
I'm a resident of Lahaina for about 18 years, and we just had the worst disaster I've ever seen. All Lahaina is burnt to a crisp, and it's like an apocalypse.
Fires which began on Tuesday night were made worse by powerful winds from a hurricane offshore fanning the flames. The state's acting governor, Sylvia Luke, said the authorities were caught out.
We expect rain, sometimes we expect floods. We never anticipated in this state that a hurricane which did not make impact on our islands will cause this type of wildfires.
The U.S. Coast Guard said poor visibility caused by the smoke hampered helicopters reaching those who'd sought sanctuary in the ocean after they dived in to escape the smoke and flames. They managed to get more than a dozen people to safety by boat, but Kakoa Lansford, who lives in Lahaina, said he saw bodies still floating in the water.
This will take years for fix. Years. This is not even the worst of it. Still get dead bodies in the water floating and on the seawall. They've been sitting there since last night. We've been pulling people out since last night, trying to save people's lives. And I feel like we're not getting the help we need.
Some of the fires are still burning. The U.S. National Guard, Navy and Marines have been mobilized, and visitors are being asked to leave, with airlines putting on extra flights. One local said their paradise had been destroyed, and the authorities state it could take months to know the full extent of the damage.
The head of the police service of Northern Ireland has said he is deeply sorry for what he called an industrial-scale breach of data after some personal details of 10,000 police and civilian staff were accidentally made public. The Chief Constable, Simon Byrne, blamed a system failure. He told members of Northern Ireland's policing board that the force hadn't confirmed claims that dissident Republicans have already obtained copies of the information. One of the policing board members, Sinn Féin's Jerry Kelly, said the data breach was unprecedented in its magnitude, and he questioned whether the force had the capacity to fix the problem without outside help. From Belfast, Charlotte Gallagher reports.
This has been a disastrous few days for the police service of Northern Ireland, with morale among officers at rock bottom. All of their names were accidentally published online when the force was responding to a Freedom of Information request. Then details of a second data breach emerged just 24 hours later. A police laptop, radio and another list of names were stolen from a car in July. An emergency policing board meeting was called today so senior politicians could question the Chief Constable. Simon Byrne cut short his holiday to return to Belfast to deal with the crisis. The meeting went on for longer than expected, with discussions going on for more than 4 hours. It was described as robust by 2 board members. admitting the data breach was on an industrial scale. Mr. Burns said he was deeply sorry, but played down fears the list of 10,000 names, including those working with MI5 here, was in the hands of dissident Republicans.
We are now aware that dissident Republicans claim to be in possession of some of this information circulating on WhatsApp, and as we speak, we are advising officers and staff about how to deal with that and any further risk that they face. We haven't yet been able to verify what the substance is behind that claim or see any of the information that dissident Republicans assert that they have.
It's that suggestion that has been most worrying to officers. Dissident Republicans were behind the attempted murder of a well-known detective in Omagh in February. The security situation in Northern Ireland means some officers don't even tell family and friends what they do for work. No staff have been rehoused yet, and it's not known if any are asking to be moved. As the public face and leader of the PSNI, Simon Byrne has been under intense scrutiny, but today insisted he had no plans to resign.
My priority is about the well-being of officers and staff as we navigate our way through this crisis. But equally, I know it's a question that people will be asking. I don't think leadership is about walking away. It's facing up to your responsibilities, and I think the organisation needs consistency and calm heads at the moment across the team to lead us through what we accept is an unprecedented crisis.
The Sinn Féin politician Jerry Kelly was at the policing board meeting. He said the chief constable now faces a huge test.
There is a job to be done. The test, and if you ever wanted a test for a chief constable and a senior executive team, then the test has been given to them now.
The immediate concerns for the PSNI are the safety of officers and ensuring a data breach like this can never happen again. But the financial implications of this error may be huge. Lawyers are already making it known that they will represent officers and other employees who have had their identities revealed. With more than 10,000 people affected, the potential compensation bill could run to tens of millions of pounds.
Ukraine says it will operate a temporary humanitarian corridor for commercial ships through the Black Sea from tomorrow. Several vessels have been stuck in Ukrainian ports since Russia launched its invasion last year. Moscow has not said whether it has agreed to Ukraine's proposal, and officials in Kiev have conceded there will still be threats from mines and the Russian Navy. From Kiev, James Waterhouse reports.
It is unlikely we will suddenly see an armada of vessels leaving the Ukrainian ports Kiev still controls. Russia has resumed its blockade of port cities such as Odessa after pulling out of a landmark deal last month which allowed Ukraine to export grain through an agreed Black Sea route. Both sides have since said they'd see any vessel as a legitimate target, and yet the Ukrainian Navy has announced this new humanitarian route in the absence of any obvious acknowledgement from Russia. It is not clear whether they'd be escorted or have to go it alone. Officers say they'll stream footage from cameras on the ships to show that the mission was purely humanitarian and not military. The paths have reportedly been sent to the International Maritime Organization, but there are shipping companies and insurers who need convincing too, as well as the dominant Russian Navy.
NHS figures show the waiting list for hospital treatment in England has passed 7.5 million for the first time. The data from the end of June shows an increase of 100,000 on the previous month. The NHS Confederation, which represents hospital managers, said the numbers should provide further impetus to resolve ongoing industrial action. More details from our health editor, Hugh Pym.
There were 7.57 million patients waiting for planned appointments, procedures or operations in June in England, up from 7.47 million the previous month and 3 million more than before the pandemic. For those who still haven't been treated, there's discomfort and a condition which is getting worse. Dave Finnan has been waiting since the end of 2019 for a knee operation. He told The World at One the situation was getting unbearable.
I'm on 3,500, so they're the strongest painkillers you can get. I'm eating them like Smarties now. And then when you go to bed of a night, in and out of bed, the pain, more painkillers. My partner, she was never getting any sleep. It was getting to the point where we were going to get separate beds.
NHS England said the longest wait, over 18 months, had been significantly reduced and that more than 100,000 appointments had to be rescheduled in June because of the junior doctors' strike. Saffron Cordery of NHS providers representing trusts said there were growing concerns about the of strikes.
Absolutely critical that we do see an end to the industrial action, and when I speak to trust chief executives, trust leaders, the thing they say to me is that they're really keen that this ends before winter.
The Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, said the waiting list had been growing long before the strikes, and the main factor was underinvestment in the NHS. Another 4-day strike by junior doctors in England begins tomorrow, with no sign of formal pay talks getting underway.
The Prime Minister has insisted there will be no more talks on NHS pay. Our political correspondent Susan Hume considers if this could change as waiting lists continue to grow.
No tricks, no ambiguity. Judge us on the effort we put in and the results we achieve. That was the bold promise made by Rishi Sunak in January when he pledged to make sure NHS waiting lists in England would fall and people would get care more quickly. 7 months on and Downing Street will be hoping people aren't judging them just yet. The unprecedented series of doctor strikes threatens to derail the achievement of the goal as the number of cancelled operations and appointments heads for 1 million. No minister has commented on these latest figures, but the Department of Health insisted it was making progress and pointed to the drop in patients waiting more than a year for treatment. Labour Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting accused the Prime Minister of being completely absent and called on him to get doctors around the table to negotiate an end to the strikes.
A deal has reportedly been reached between the United States and Iran to free 5 Americans from jail in Tehran. The agreement is understood to include the unfreezing of $6 billion in Iranian assets. Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucet reports.
One of the men, Siamak Namazi, has spent nearly 8 years in jail, accused like the others of spying for the U.S. Sources have told the BBC the Americans will only be able to leave Iran once $6 billion of Iranian assets, now in South Korea, are transferred to the Central Bank of Qatar, where the money will be used only for humanitarian purchases, such as medicine or food. This process could take several weeks. Once the Americans are freed, 3 Iranians serving prison sentences in the U.S. will also be released. This news has given rare hope to families that their loved ones will soon come home.
A retired British man who was cleared of murdering his seriously ill wife in Cyprus could face a retrial. Lawyers for David Hunter, who's 76, say the Cypriot Attorney General has filed an appeal against the outcome of his trial, in which he was convicted of manslaughter but released after spending 19 months in custody. Richard Galpin reports.
Last month, David Hunter was found not guilty of premeditated murder, a charge which carries a mandatory life sentence, and was convicted of manslaughter instead. During his trial, the retired miner said his wife Janice had for several weeks begged him to kill her because of pain caused by her blood cancer. Mr. Hunter was released from custody given the time he'd already spent in jail. The Attorney General in Cyprus is now seeking to overturn the court's verdict, with prosecutors appealing against the lesser conviction and pushing instead for Mr. Hunter to be tried for murder again. They are disappointed with the decision, which they say gets in the way of him resuming his life. Mr. Hunter's daughter Leslie said she was devastated and urged Cypriot officials again to show compassion for her frail and elderly father.
Around 12,500 jobs are at risk after the retailer Wilko entered administration. The company said it had been left with no choice after failing to agree a rescue deal. Our business reporter Peter Ruddick has been speaking to shoppers in Cheshire.
After more than 90 years trading, having grown from a single store in Leicester to more than 400 across the UK, the future of one of the most recognisable names on the high street hangs in the balance. Analysts say Wilko has struggled recently because it has been uncompetitive on price, lacks investment, and been located in the wrong places to make a profit. These were the views of people leaving the Wilko store here on Altrincham High Street.
It's been here for such a long time, and it means going out of town to find a similar shop, which is useless for people who live nearby like myself.
I feel like we'll be able to get the same elsewhere, so It's convenient, but there's other options.
Well, I use it nearly every single day. I only work in Altrincham, so the fact that that's going, it's like a modern-day Woolworths, isn't it?
Administrators say that for now, it is business as usual for Wilko, with all its shops remaining open and staff being paid. In a letter stuck to the window of each Wilko store, the company's chief executive, Mark Jackson, said there had been significant interest from potential rescuers, but that the firm had run out of time and cash to agree a deal. If any buyer comes forward, they will have to decide how many sites and employees to save, or whether to change Wilko's model entirely.
The UK's biggest mortgage lender, Halifax, says it will reduce rates by up to 0.71 percentage points on some of its fixed mortgage deals. Other major lenders, including HSBC and Nationwide, announced changes to some of their deals earlier this week. Our cost of living correspondent, Kevin Peachy, has been looking at what this means for homeowners.
After mortgage rates went up to their highest level for 15 years, homeowners will hope this is the start of them heading back down. But it's rarely as simple as that. Lenders are responding to expectations that the Bank of England's interest rate may not stay as high for as long. Russ Mould is an analyst at investment firm AJ Bell.
Banks will be looking not just at where interest rates are now, but where they will be over the entire term of the deal. And I think there is a hope, at least, that we may be nearing a peak in Bank of England interest rates, and if there is a chance of a peak at some stage in the next 12 months, then after a peak, logically we'll get some cuts.
Lack of activity in the housing market is also creating greater competition among mortgage providers, but forecasts can change, and the reality is that many thousands of borrowers who are remortgaging now are still likely to pay hundreds of pounds more in monthly repayments than they did under their previous deal, and there's little hope of a return of the ultra-low rates many people enjoyed for more than a decade. That's left some under financial pressure. Figures from the banking sector today reveal in the past year there's been a 9% rise in borrowers who've fallen behind on mortgage payments. For them, the higher cost of living throws a shadow over the glimmer of hope provided by the prospect of falling rates.
The West African Regional Bloc, ECOWAS, has ordered the deployment of its standby force to Niger to restore democracy after last month's military coup. ECOWAS had previously warned those behind the takeover to reinstate the elected president Mohamed Bazoum by last Sunday or risk the potential use of force. But now they say engaging in dialogue is the priority, as our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding explains.
Niger's neighbours are looking for ways to push the country back to democracy. After a meeting of regional leaders, it was announced that a relatively small joint military force would be put on alert, most likely to secure Niger's borders at this stage. At the same meeting, Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu said diplomacy needed to be given more of a chance.
And reaffirming our relentless commitment to democracy, human rights, and the well-being of the people of Niger, it is crucial that we prioritize diplomatic negotiations and dialogue as the bedrock of our approach.
Some will find that reassuring. There's a chance that economic sanctions and political pressure on impoverished, landlocked Niger will persuade the generals there to agree to a timetable for a return to democracy. But the coup plotters may equally feel emboldened. They've just named a new cabinet, and they're still holding Niger's legitimate president in custody, with growing international concern about safety. There are certainly good reasons for concern, even alarm. In recent years, coups and conflicts have spread right across a swathe of Africa, just below the Sahara Desert. From Mali to Sudan and now Niger, instability is growing. Democracy is in retreat. Russian mercenaries and Islamist militants are gaining influence, and millions of civilians are struggling.
The outgoing president of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, says the country's election will go ahead as planned later this month, despite the assassination of a candidate. Fernando Villavicencio was shot dead as he left a rally in the capital, Quito. Here's our South America correspondent, Katie Watson.
Videos on social media show Fernando Villavicencio leaving a campaign event surrounded by personal security and walking towards a pickup truck. When the shooting starts, the person filming clearly drops down behind the vehicle to protect themselves. The killing comes less than 2 weeks before the presidential elections, Mr Villavicencio's popularity was rising, and recent polls put him in second place. The current president, Guillermo Lasso, has declared a state of emergency that said the elections wouldn't be called off.
Faced with the loss of a Democrat and a fighter, the elections aren't suspended. On the contrary, they have to be held. Democracy has to be strengthened. This is a political crime that has a terrorist character, and we don't doubt that this assassination is an attempt to sabotage the electoral process.
Mr Villavicencio has been very outspoken about crime and corruption and was one of the few candidates to allege links between the government and organised crime in Ecuador. This attack, though, is clear evidence of just how much power the gangs have. The group which claims to have carried out the murder, Los Lobos, or the Wolves, is the second biggest in the country, with as many as 8,000 members. It's also been involved in deadly prison fights that have left many inmates dead.
The UK, the US and Canada have announced coordinated sanctions against the former governor of Lebanon's central bank, who's facing corruption allegations. Riyad Salameh and 3 of his close associates are accused of diverting around $300 million of the bank's funds for personal gain. They've also been handed travel bans and had their assets frozen. Mr. Salameh denies the claims. Figures published later this morning are set to show more than 100,000 migrants have been picked up in the UK after crossing the Channel in small boats.